How are you guys? Don't do people.
Oh my God, so how do you guys talk about it with me, Jack?
Because I did research.
You're right.
Contagious right now. So I'm gonna write my presentation on my paper. Just because what I didn't do well.
So today we're going to close out the cardiac cycle and get through as much of cardiac output as we can. So hopefully you've taken a look at your textbook for that section because I know our exam's coming up. It's coming to the end of our course super rapidly. But it's pretty simple, so hopefully it won't be too bad. So we left off here thinking about our ventricular volume. So we're thinking about the fact that we can measure how much our heart fills in total, our end diastolic volume, how much blood is left in our heart at the end of systole, so at the end of squeezing, our end systolic volume. And we can get a difference, our stroke volume. So that's going to be how much blood actually goes out to the body during that ventricular ejection phase. Okay. So we know that we can have a total number for that in milliliters, right? Because you'd be measuring literally how much blood is in this heart at the end of diastole, right? And you're going to get a number with your units in milliliters. Now, this is great for us, and this will be useful when we're thinking about cardiac output later. But if you're in a clinic, this might not be the most useful thing because different people are different sizes, different hearts are different sizes. So a number in milliliters would be difficult to check like against a table as to whether that's a normal, acceptable, useful value. So what we actually tend to do instead to kind of standardize this across people is take one step further, right? So if you were trying to compare, is this as much blood as we want to be coming out of a person's heart? To standardize it so it's not so dependent specifically on body size, specifically on the size of that heart, what you would look at is something called the ejection fraction, or EF. So we're going to be using stroke volume more when we get to cardiac output, but if you move forward and think about patients and stuff, you may be using this instead. What this is really just turning this into a ratio, right? So we're still thinking about that stroke volume, still thinking, is that enough blood? Is that as much blood as we want coming out of the heart? But instead of thinking about this in milliliters, we're going to be thinking about this as a percentage of a person's blood, but not really all the blood in their body at any given time, a percentage of the blood that fills the heart. That's really all this is, right? So we know that our end diastolic volume, our EDV, right, was how much blood filled the heart at the end of diastole, right? So now we're looking at what percent of that did we squeeze out when the heart finishes systole, right? So the volume that we got rid of, the volume we ejected, is our stroke volume. Right, so our ejection fraction is a fraction, that amount squeezed out, stroke volume, divided by our biggest number, our end diastolic volume, that filling volume. So a typical number for this would be 54% at rest, or in decimal form, 0.54 when we're using this ejection fraction number. This one's more easily comparable between patients when you're working in a clinic. Okay. So here I've pulled out a couple of segments of our big cardiac cycle chart for you. And what we're looking at is this kind of when you would be able to measure these in our cardiac cycle. Right. So what we're looking at are volumes of blood. Right. So what we're looking at is the volume section of that chart. Right. And we're noticing that during our ventricular filling phase, this is going up, right? So we could measure our maximum either at the very tail end of phase one where we're completely full, but it would probably be easiest to measure during phase two, that isovolumetric contraction phase, because that's where we have a plateau, right? At that biggest volume, our end diastolic volume. Okay, so the end of diastole is right here as we end phase one and begin to contract as we go into phase two. So it's really this divider when we hit that maximum volume for the first time. Okay. For our end systolic volume, the end of systole, when we stop squeezing, is when we finish our isovolumetric contraction, do our ventricular ejection. So the stroke volume is actually coming out of the heart, going into the aorta at this point, right? And then we enter diastole again here as we do our isovolumetric relaxation for phase four, right? So we can see that that is when we're hitting that end systolic volume as well, right? So we got this plateau in phase four, we hit it at the end of phase three, right? So this is when we would measure how much is left in the heart at the end, that end systolic. And that's easier than, trying to measure like how much is coming out second for second into the aorta, right? Like the way we find stroke volume is really looking at these two volumes that are a bit more easily measurable because they're contained in specific secrets. You can see how that stroke volume is really just the difference between the two. So when you think about that equation for stroke volume, really try and think of it as this relationship. It's easier than memorizing an equation to realize that subtraction really just is a difference, right? Like we're really just describing what happened here with the math. And we got our whole big table together going through the cardiac cycle, linked together our phase names. We can see where the blood is traveling during each of these phases. We can see what's the state of our AV valves, what's the state of our semilunar valves. We've got all our different types of pressure shown here. We've got our blood volumes in the ventricles. We, at the bottom, linked it up to our electrocardiogram. So remember our PQRST waves. And we have our heart sounds on here. Right? So we see that the heart sounds we're noticing in phases 2 and 4. That's our heart sound in a second, which is pointing that up. But first, we're going to discuss our pressure volume curve real quick. So our pressure volume curve, we're still talking about those same phases. So these are not new phases. Just pointing that out because we had our different phases when we were thinking about like electrical activity, and then we had different phases when we were thinking about cardiac cycle. We're staying with the cardiac cycle ones here. Yeah. So we've got a sort of cycle we can trace as we relate our volume in the ventricles to our pressure in the ventricles, right? We know that there's this relationship, right? As our ventricle gets larger, we don't change the volume, it drops in pressure. As our ventricle squeezes, if we don't change the volume, that pressure goes up. We do know that during some of these phases, we do fill with blood. During some of these phases, we do eject blood. So we do have a little bit of a volume change at certain points, right? So tracing through what's going on here. Again, we're thinking about this from the perspective of the ventricle. Ultimately, we're really thinking about this from the perspective of the left ventricle specifically, because we're most interested in is blood getting out to the body. Right? We can trace through our phases. Right? So recognizing this is just another expression of what we've talked through already. Okay. If we look, if we're looking for phase 1, we know that what's happening during phase 1 is filling. Right? So find phase 1. We're looking for something where our volume of blood in the heart goes up. The only spot on here we see that, right, is between here and here, right? So this is our phase one. So phase one, we can see our arrow going to the right. We see ventricular volume going up because blood is coming into the ventricle in this case. We'll notice that while we have this blood coming in, there's a little bit of a change in pressure, but not a lot. Right? So not too much pressure change as we fill with blood, because our heart is pretty relaxed. And we'll talk later, and we'll spend a lot of time in A&P2 on the idea of compliance, right? Which is part of why I'm having you notice here that we've got these sloped lines that show relationships between volume and pressure, because that's going to become important later on. Right now, we're noticing that we're filling with volume, a little bit of pressure, but not much. Okay. So for phase two, okay, this is when we start contracting. We know it's specifically isovolumetric, so same volume contraction, right, until we get the pressure up big enough to open our semilunar valve, right? So for phase two, we're looking for a straight line up, as you can find here. Right, so this is our pressure shooting up, no volume change because this is that isovolumetric contraction, right? So here we see that dramatic rise until we hit a point at which the pressure is enough that we have a high to low pressure gradient that forces those semilunar valves open as we have blood shooting into the aorta from the perspective of the left ventricle, right? So that's when we start to see a change in volume again, right? So once those valves are open, blood is physically going to leave the heart and go into the aorta. So we see our volume coming back down. So volume down means we're going to the left. Right? And we can see that during phase three, we're squeezing harder and harder. And we can tell that because this line is still going up for pressure, right? So for phase three, we're losing volume, pressure is still going up. Our pressure has to keep going up because we're squeezing out that smaller volume of blood, right? So this is kind of how we're doing that. Phase four resets us, right? So phase four, you can see we reached our end systolic volume, right? So we can see here, so that's actually on this graph, right? So our end systolic volume, our volume at the end of squeezing, is 60. Our end diastolic volume, oh my God, I'm saying, end systolic volume is here. Our end diastolic volume was actually on here too. Our maximum at the end of filling. The difference between them was our stroke volume. All right, so we reach our end systolic volume when we're done squeezing at the end of phase three. And now we relax. And so for this phase four, that relaxation phase, that first part of diastole, is isovolumetric. So all our valves are closed as we're relaxing. These valves are closed, the semilunar valves are closed. All right, so we've got to drop straight down. Only thing that's changing is our pressure. So this is just a different way to represent our relationships between volume and pressure during this cardiac cycle. So now we're going to think about heart sounds, which I always think is fun. Okay. So people think of heart sounds sometimes erroneously as the actual sound of the valves moving, but it's not quite that, okay? Heart sounds do have to do with the valves, but when we think about the heart sounds, we want to think about sloshing, right? So if a valve is just open and blood is flowing smoothly, there's no sound. So smooth flow, think like, I don't know, water that like completely fills a pipe, right? Like usually unless something's going wrong, you don't hear your walls sloshing all the time because there's water in your pipes, right? When you do hear sloshing, it's because you've changed something, right? Like you turned on a faucet or you've flushed a toilet, right? There's suddenly some weird kind of movement that wasn't there before. And that's what's going on with our heart sound. So our heart sounds, we're thinking like waves crashing on the beach, right? We're hearing what we refer to as turbulent flow. So turbulent flow is that kind of messy movement. Okay. So that messy movement happens as the valves move because the blood starts kind of crashing back on the valves, getting kind of shaken around, getting blocked as it tries to move backwards but can't, and hits these valves. So we hear these heart sounds when we see that movement in the valve, but it's the blood making the sound, not the valve itself. So heart sounds have two parts, right? We think lub dub for a heart sound. That's because we have our two types of valves, right? So we can hear this turbulent flow when the AV valves close. That's our first heart sound, the lub part. And then we can hear a second heart sound, the dub part, when our semilunar valves close. Yeah. So what we're thinking about is this back shift of blood towards the atrium. Let's kind of draw it out real quick so we can see what I mean. All right. I think I did this as we were talking through the cardiac cycle on its own before, right? But what we're hearing is, let's actually draw this with our AV valves on it right now. Okay. All right. So as the AV valves close, as we go into our isovolumetric contraction, so phase 2, right? What we're hearing is that as this comes to a high pressure, right, this would tend to force blood backwards because now we have lower pressure in the atrium, but we don't want blood to flow backwards in the heart. So what happens is we hit these valves, right? They close over, right? Think of them flapping together. Okay, so we're going to turn that into a solid line now, right? But we can hear the blood kind of trying to go that way, trying to find somewhere to escape, right? So we're hearing this turbulent flow until we open a smooth pathway as the semilunar valves open into our blood vessels, specifically into our aorta. So if we think about the second sound, right, we have our cup-shaped semilunar valves here, right? So we have the same situation, just at a different point in time, right? So as we are relaxing, right, we start creating a low pressure environment here while we have a high pressure environment in the aorta where we just squeezed all our blood to, right? So if we have high pressure here relative to lower pressure back towards our left ventricle, right, our blood would want to flow backwards, but this swoops open the cusps of the semilunar valves, so we can't get backwards, those close, right? That's important for our isovolumetric relaxation, that phase 3 of our cardiac cycle, right? So our blood can't get there, but we can hear this kind of crashing as that blood tries to flow in that direction as these close. One thing I think we probably mentioned in the videos you watched about the valves, I'm just going to point out, right, the difference between the way that the valves function, the AV valve and the semilunar valve. One of the traits that we saw on those AV valves was our chordae tendineae, right? So those tendinous cords, those little heartstrings, right? They're there in part because of this huge force, right? They're preventing these valves from blowing back into the atrium and opening up that way, just because of this really high pressure that we're creating from the squeezing. Okay. So on our chart, we can see that, right? So it's in phases 2 and then 4, right? As we just have these valve changes, we hear these sounds. Let's take a listen to what they sound like. So we're starting with a healthy heart. So that's a healthy heart. We hear the lub dub. So what we're hearing is the blood moving as these valves have just closed, and we hear this turbulent flow swishing around. Part of why people listen to your heart, okay, is because it's important that your blood is flowing in the proper direction through the chambers in order, flowing out to your blood vessels. And you can hear in those sounds some changes there if we have pathology, if we have something going wrong, right? So you can like hear valve issues, right? Like you could hear a heart murmur, right? You can hear changes of different types. And if you're well trained, you can even kind of diagnose them based on what exactly the change is in the heart valve. So what we're going to listen to next is a heart sound of a heart with aortic stenosis. So what aortic stenosis is, stenosis, think like stone. It's the aortic valve kind of hardening, so it doesn't function properly. You can also hear that maybe this heart is beating a little faster potentially, but do you hear that blurriness on the second sound, right? Instead of being like lub dub, we're hearing like lub brr, right? So this has to do with the stenosis of the valve, right? Like it's not quite closing appropriately and as quickly as it should. So we hear this kind of blurry sound for the second part of this heartbeat. You almost kind of don't hear it. I'm not a perfect expert in diagnosing everybody's heart sound, so please don't ask me to pull out my stethoscope and do it right now on all of you and check your heart. But if you're curious, like it's fun to click around on these. There are a bunch of like YouTube videos on how to interpret them, and quizzes for yourselves for the future if you go on to study this more in depth. And I really like it. It's always fun. So we're going to move forward and think about our final topic, which is cardiac output. Cardiac output, which we're going to understand the role of overall. Really, we're thinking about how much blood in total gets up your body. We'll look at the equation in a second. But this is going to have to do with the stroke volume, and it's going to have to do with our heart rate. So we know some things about these various topics. So let's think about way ahead of time. We're eventually going to get to controlling cardiac output. Which branch of the nervous system do you think we're going to be thinking about when we get to this control part? Because we have talked about this a number of times because I like it as an easily interpretable example. Okay, let's take a peek. Okay. Yeah, so when we get to the regulation piece, after we go through how to calculate cardiac output, we're going to be thinking about how we can change cardiac output. And that's one of the things that I want to make sure that you guys are paying attention to when you get to the exam, right? We're not going to be doing actually a lot of math, but I do want you to be thinking about, okay, if we change this, what goes up, what goes down, right? So one of the big things we're going to be thinking about is changes to heart rate, okay? And we're going to see that our autonomic nervous system, that automatic type of control, is going to play a big role here. So we're going to see that both our sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system are going to have a role to play. Our sympathetic is going to be able to actually do more stuff than our parasympathetics are, but for heart rate, we're going to see both of these can change it. So sympathetic, that fight or flight part, would raise your heartbeat, right? You feel your heart going extra fast. Parasympathetics, slow it down, right? So you can slow down, you can relax. And in fact, like most of the time, you right now hopefully have your parasympathetic active on that heart rate at the moment, because we know that SA node actually, its natural pacemaker potential is kind of fast. Okay. So our technical equation for cardiac output is just, all right, our total blood is going to be our stroke volume. So this is like our blood per heartbeat times, right? Then our heart rate is just our beats per minute. Right, so what our cardiac output is really just going to be is how much blood do you get per minute. That's all we're trying to figure out. The amount of blood that goes out to your body in 1 minute. Right. So we've talked about how we can calculate that stroke volume, right? So we know our stroke volume is our end diastolic volume minus our end systolic volume. So how much we filled. We're looking for the amount we squeezed out. The floor, we've got that end systolic volume, what remains in the heart. And we multiply that out by the heart rate. Okay. When I say it's simple, hopefully if you think about it in those terms, kind of simple. Okay, so we're going to see that we have two ways that we could raise our cardiac output, right? So if you want more blood going out to the body per minute, you can squeeze out more blood, increase your stroke volume, or you can squeeze more frequently. You can increase your heart rate, right? Because every time you have an extra heartbeat in a minute, that's one extra of those stroke volumes you'd be getting per minute. And conversely, right, if you want to lower cardiac output, you don't want as much blood flowing through your body, you can decrease either of those factors. Usually if we're trying to decrease, what we're going to be thinking about is heart rate, because of what the parasympathetics are and aren't able to control. And we'll get to that detail. So on average, your average cardiac output at rest is 5 liters per minute. Okay, so 5 liters of blood every minute is going out to your body. The average volume of blood in a person's body is 5.5 liters. So not quite all of your blood going around your body in 1 minute, but pretty close. Okay. So I did just say this, but select as many things as would increase our cardiac output based on that equation that we just looked at. Great. Yeah, so I was just looking for a super simple increasing either of those things or multiplying together. Heart rate or stroke volume is our direct way to increase cardiac output. Those of you who said decrease in length of cardiac cycle. We're not going to think about it that way, but if you were linking that up to if the cardiac cycle goes really quick, that means more heartbeats per minute. Then not wrong, but we don't usually discuss it that way. Okay. All right. So our two factors we're paying attention to: heart rate, stroke volume. Anytime either of those changes are cardiac output changes, we're not going to see them go in opposite directions. So if they're going up, they'll go up together, or the other one won't do anything. We're not going to see like one go up and one go down, and you have to figure out what's more. Everything's kind of moving in the same direction, so that's helpful for us. So when we're getting to the exam, that's ultimately our question when we're trying to figure out effects on cardiac output is, did something change one of these and which direction did it go, right? So when we think about that, diving a little deeper, we're going to be thinking about different types of regulation. So extrinsic, stuff farther away from the heart, intrinsic, stuff close to the heart. Okay, so extrinsic, we're thinking hormones and we're thinking nerve. Intrinsic, we're going to see there's a little bit of auto-regulation. So there's going to be a little piece of this that is affected by like how much blood did the heart fill with. And that'll be our last little bit. Let's look at how our nerves link up to the heart. So I'm going to highlight for us here. Yeah, we'll use orange. Okay, so we remember, hopefully, our parasympathetic nerves are craniosacral in origin, meaning we've got cranial nerves that are parasympathetic, and we would have some sacral nerves that are parasympathetic. Realistically, we never think about them, but they do exist. Okay, so our parasympathetics are all coming from the vagus nerve when we're out in the body beyond the head and neck. This runs down like 2/3 of the way through your intestines. So definitely as far as the heart. So our vagus nerve links up to our SA node, and it links up to our AV node, right? We've got two branches of the vagus nerve that go to these specific spots. Our sympathetics are thoracolumbar in origin, so meaning they come from our thoracic vertebrae levels of the spinal cord and these first two lumbar vertebrae, so from the middle of your body. We know that they can take various routes to get out to the body, but the ones that go to the heart are coming from these first parts of your thoracic spine. You don't need to know that particular fact, but it happens to be true. They go through your sympathetic chain or your sympathetic trunk here. They merge together into a cardiac nerve and then split back out. You don't need to know those routes, but what you do want to know is where they end up, right? So you got a sympathetic branch going to your SA node, just like you had a branch of the vagus or your parasympathetics. You've got a branch going to your AV node, just like we had a branch of the parasympathetics. But we've got an extra spot that those sympathetic nerves are going to, which is that they're also going to the ventricular myocardium. Okay, so we also have a piece of our sympathetic innervation that is going to the heart muscle of the ventricle. And the parasympathetics don't do that. So that is why I was saying earlier that our sympathetics can have a little more of an effect on our cardiac output, that they can do an extra thing because they have an extra place they're going, right? So we're going to see that our parasympathetics and sympathetics can both affect our heart rate, but no, I didn't have a question. Okay, great. Then I'll just tell you. Okay. Both of our branches, the parasympathetics and the sympathetics, can affect our heart rate because they are both going to those pacemaker cells in our AV node and our SA node. Right, so that's where we control our heart rate. But only our sympathetics are going to be able to control stroke volume because only the sympathetics have a connection to that ventricular muscle. Right? So this is why we're going to see slightly different ability to affect cardiac output. when we're thinking about changes in heart rate, okay, our heart rate is just how often is that SA node firing. Our SA node is the fastest of our pacemaker potentials, pacemaker cells in our electroconductive system throughout the heart. So it wins because everybody else gets interrupted by the SA node sending action potentials through the system, even though they have their own firing rates. Right? The SA node intrinsic firing rate, because it has its own pacemaker potential, even if you took SA node cells and put them in a petri dish, they would still do this. Right? So its intrinsic rate is 100 beats per minute. So it's 100 beats per minute if you're doing absolutely nothing, which means most of the time you are doing something because let's see what my heart rate is. Hopefully not that high. I don't know. Never mind. Hopefully your heart rate's not at 100. That's not usually what it should be when you're sitting down. Usually it's like supposed to be around like 75, 80 if you're got a really good cardiovascular system, strong heart rate, maybe you're down at like 60 or something. Not me, I'm an anxious person. But you shouldn't be up at 100 if you're just sitting here listening to stuff. Okay, so usually at rest, when you're relaxed, you're not stressed out, the parasympathetic innervation actually is doing something, which is that it's slowing down your heart rate from its baseline firing rate. Okay, so at rest, we're around 75, coming from that vagus nerve, from that branch, specifically to the SA node, right? But we've got connection to the AV node too, so the AV node isn't going to like suddenly jump up and be above the SA node in its speed. And in our flip side, if you are really stressed out, if you are really anxious, if you're up and doing stuff, if you're fighting, if you're fleeing, we can shoot above 100, right? So you can go up to, I don't know, 100, 180-ish, right? With this sympathetic nervous system taking over. We'll probably get even higher than that, but that's my personal goal. Okay. So the way this works is when we see increased sympathetic activity, and we're usually thinking those nerves, but remember that like we have this association between the sympathetic nervous system and your adrenal glands, and specifically that adrenal medulla and the epinephrine that we can put out from there. So we'll just go ahead and link in that epinephrine, which acts as a hormone right now, with this sympathetic activity. Okay, so as we have this increased sympathetic activity, sending signals towards the heart, or we have epinephrine coming towards the heart. Here's part of why we thought about receptors and the different types of receptors. We've got beta-1 receptors. So remember more formally, right, these would be adrenergic receptors, beta-1 adrenergic. We've got the epinephrine listed here. We know that a lot of sympathetic activity is our norepinephrine, right? So that's what we're responding to. So this is the type of receptor you would have in the SA node that respond to this signaling from the nerves or from your epinephrine. What it does is it increases the opening of our sodium and calcium channels, right? So we know that these are cations, positive ions that want to come into cells based on the natural concentrations we have set up in like plasma and cytoplasm, right? So when they come in, we know that creates a depolarization. It's a rise in membrane potential, gets us towards an action potential a little quicker. So this ends up increasing how fast we depolarize. So we still have a pacemaker rate, right? It just works quicker because we have more open channels. So our increased rate of spontaneous depolarization means we send out these pulses faster, which means we have an increase in the heart rate overall. That's the formal specific steps that gets us to that increase in heart rate from our sympathetics or from epinephrine. Near the end of class. I'm not actually going to ask you to do calculations on the test. But you could, all right? And I think you did this question in Phys Lab, so we'll skip it for now. I'll skip writing out. Yes, I clicked it on, sorry. Okay, so here's how you would do it if you wanted to, right? So you would calculate out your stroke volume for the first piece, right? So we have our end diastolic volume and our end systolic volume. And then you multiply towards a heart rate. Sometimes you might be given a heartbeat as like the time between heartbeats. Kind of mean, but someone could do that to you. I'd rather give you a heart rate, usually. But if you had to, you divide a minute, so 60 seconds, by how much time there was between the heart rates to get that heart rate in the appropriate units. We're going to be a little fuzzy on the exams and just think about these going up and going down. And we just calculate that out for a total cardiac output. So this is a realistic potential number for what this might look like when our sympathetic nervous system is active, right? So it's not the case that you could maximum cycle all your blood through the heart in 1 minute. You can put that blood through at a clip. So here we're taking a peek at some of those receptors involved. We don't have to walk through this stuff in detail, but we're just noticing, right, our neurotransmitters and hormones associated with sympathetic nervous activity are binding to this beta-1 receptor. We know it's a beta-1 receptor, or we know it's a beta receptor because it's activating this cyclic A&P pathway. And it's beta-1 partially because I told you so. We know we're ultimately going to know that this is a type of receptor we have in the heart, right? And here we can see the specific types of channels that cyclic A&P ultimately turns on. Okay. So from the sympathetic side, right? So parasympathetics are our rest and digest part of the autonomic nervous system. They're craniosacral. Almost always, it's the vagus nerve when we're paying attention to this. So that cranial nerve 10, super important. Okay. Now we know that parasympathetics, right, they don't make norepinephrine, they don't make epinephrine. Good, they're making something different because otherwise this heart stuff would get messy, right? We know that parasympathetics are all about acetylcholine, right? So they're about acetylcholine when we're thinking preganglionic to postganglionic nerve. Right? We know those are our nicotinic cholinergic receptors in the middle of the pathway because they need to work quickly, right? So they're that ionotropic kind. But at the effector organ end of our postganglionic nerve in our parasympathetic pathway, we know we have a new type of cholinergic receptor, right? So this is still acetylcholine, still the same neurotransmitter, but our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are metabotropic. They operate using a protein coupled receptor, basically. And so we get more variation in what we can do. This can operate a little more slowly at the effector organ. So that's the type of cholinergic receptor we see in the heart. So vagus nerve goes to the heart, goes to the SA node. It's got this typical type of cholinergic receptor that we expect from those postganglionic parasympathetic effector organ connections. And what this does is it opens potassium channels. So we know potassium channels. Potassium wants to leave the cell, right? So we know if potassium is leaving the cell, that could like hyperpolarize a membrane potential, or it could just make up for, kind of even out and flatten anything that's trying to change it in the depolarization direction. So we're kind of suppressing or inhibiting action potentials this way. The other thing we're doing is we're closing some of the calcium channels. So we're also making it harder to get positive charges coming in, right? And all of this means that our depolarizations happen a little slower, right? It's a little harder, but not impossible to depolarize the cell, right? Because we still got sodium channels, we still got some calcium channels working, right? But overall, it's going to take a little more extra time, extra input to depolarize these cells. So we see a decrease in the heart rate. And here's a picture of what that looks like. All right, so here's a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. So you can see the acetylcholine, right? Choline, cholinergic, right? Specifically, this is the muscarinic type. So we can see that we've got this G protein coupled receptor here. So a little more complicated pathway for having effect. And we can see it's opening, that's what the plus is, the potassium channel, and it's closing the minus sign, some of these calcium channels. And that's the level to which we want to know this stuff. So our end result are some shifts to our heart rate. So what we're looking at is over time, what we're like, let's think about, okay. Sorry, figuring out which one to describe to you first. Whatever, we'll start with rest. Okay. So we can see this resting heart rate is the gray line. So here we got our 2 peaks. So hopefully that's what's happening to you about now. All right. And then we can see shifts. So if you get a little stressed out, we depolarize a little easier. So here we see 3 peaks in our little window here. Right, so these are getting closer together. Right, if we were doing out our math, ultimately, we'd notice that this is a smaller range. And if we go really slow, that parasympathetic line, lots of extra parasympathetic, we might have only 1 heartbeat. So we'll pick up there next time and think about the hormonal control, but you should have the basis of what you need big picture today.